Everybody.
Oh, hi. See you. It's great to see you. You've got a wonderful room behind you.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm surrounded by much of nature around me. So I was just ready to log on and suddenly my computer said I needed to install this update, that update, Zoom update, everything. So
Michael, I'm so happy, Michael. I can introduce you to Lord John Eatwell and Susie Digby, who is also the Lady Eatwell.
Hi, they're very pleased to meet you both.
Have you seen them here on the picture? Or
I can, yes, I can see everybody on my tiles here. Very nice to meet everybody. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, there will be more people coming. We are not many, but so I'm so happy that John and Susie could make it for today, because maybe you know Susie Digby. She is very, I mean, I don't know enough music to say anything meaningful comparing you two, but from what I understand, Lady Eatwell is also a very prominent musician.
I am very well
singers
aware of
and much more.
her work.
So I think you can
I'm
talk.
very well aware.
And
so
I checked with both of
you,
and at least I don't think you know each other. So
no, it's nice to meet properly, but please no difficult questions at the end.
Maybe Susie, you can explain a bit more to Michael as a form of introduction. You are much better at doing that than I am. Sorry, I can't hear. We can't hear you. If you,
I'm very aware of Michael's work, and I currently run a group called Aura Singers, a professional group based in London but working internationally, which is primarily a commissioning and recording choir. So we're big commissioners, as your former boss used to be.
Yes, yeah.
Of new choral music.
Are you connected to a college at the moment? Or?
We were. So my husband was president of Queen's College, Cambridge.
Okay, that's right.
I was acting music director there. And at the time that Sid was appointed initially music director at Trinity.
Okay. So that must have been around the same time that I was there in 2006, was it?
That's right. Yeah. So I arrived. So I arrived at Queen's around that time, and I remember very much the early discussions of introducing a new music director at Trinity, with the then master.
Right. Okay.
Martin Rees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I gave him some advice. Yeah, at the beginning, and Trinity, I think, has been immeasurably fortunate to have Stephen Layton as music director, and indeed you as organ scholar.
Oh well, I'm not sure how much I've contributed, but certainly Stephen has just been amazing. I'm going to talk a little bit about him as well, but and what an amazing time that was, actually, the sort of 2006 handover period. So yeah, he's an extraordinary man, extraordinary musician. Yeah,
extraordinary.
Yeah, the reason we know each other at all is that John Eatwell was teaching fellow in economics, I think, while I was teaching fellow in physics. And we had a lot of interactions with each other. So that's how we got to know each other. Otherwise, I think we wouldn't be in touch, I think. We can't hear. I think
Gerhard taught me to understand that the edge of the universe is curved, I remember.
I still remember. We also met by accident once in Heathrow. I was coming from New York and you came going to New York, so I gave you my subway New York subway tokens. That I was very surprised that we bumped into each other in Heathrow.
Right.
We also bumped into each other on High Table quite a few times.
Well, quite a few times.
And we had Tamlin Knoll was I think we met through Tamlin Knoll, if you remember her.
Yes, I remember
was
her.
One of her students, and I became she asked me to be godfather of her daughter. So,
oh gosh.
Yes,
oh, wow.
she went to
Good.
Trinity, and she's now a medical doctor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So small world.
Yeah.
I should also introduce you, Michael, to Professor Yamanouchi, who is also in the artistic sector. He is a literature professor and specialist, and he wrote books in both directions, explaining British literature in Japan and also Japanese literature to the world. So he's working in both directions, but in the field of literature. And I'm trying to also ask Professor Yamanouchi to give us a similar Zoom talk, but I couldn't convince him yet.
Oh,
well, thank
very
you.
nice to meet
you.
Very nice to meet you. And very old man. And I was in Cambridge initially 67 to 76. I was at Peterhouse, but supervised by the great Theo Redpath of Trinity, who managed to complete my PhD dissertation. So I owe him greatly. And later he arranged for me to be come back to Trinity as a visiting fellow commoner. And at that time, the music director was Dr. Richard Marlowe.
You're right. Okay.
I think who brought the Trinity Choir to Tokyo a couple of times, more than a couple of times.
Yes, I think from memory, I remember people discussing that there'd been tours to the Far East under Richard's time. I don't think there've been any in that part of the world with Stephen, but yeah, certainly under Richard there were.
Yeah, I'm sorry to all of you that I had to move this 1 hour forward. And the reason is I'm later, when we finish here, I have to run to the German embassy because they have a committee of experts who advise the German government of innovation in Germany. So they invited me to this at the German embassy. So I had to make both work. So then there's one, I have one more artist who, if you, I don't have his phone number. I'll try, who knows? He's a filmmaker and he fits also as an artist into here. So I just worrying that he didn't.
I was worried I would oversleep this morning, so I set about 11 alarms that were still going about 30 seconds before this started because I was just terribly.
I'm sorry about
Likewise, Michael. Likewise.
I'm sorry about this. It's my fault, all my fault.
Don't worry, it's fine.
But us musicians don't tend to go to bed very early.
No.
Yeah, I can't.
Also, we've been having terrible storms here the last couple of nights, and normally I sleep through anything, but it was just as I was falling asleep last night that the heavens opened and there was thunder and lightning, and it sort of made for
a slight. Cambridge.
No, I'm in North London, Islington at the moment.
Oh,
so
right.
But it was, yeah, we've had 2 or maybe even 3 nights now of pretty biblical storms at just around sort of 11 o'clock midnight. Just as we're falling asleep, and then you're sort of woken by the heavens opening. So it's been, yeah, I think summer's come to a very abrupt end here, certainly in central London anyway.
We have typhoons here in Japan. It's
really? Oh, that's true. I shouldn't complain about the weather here, really, in comparison.
Yeah, it's in Tokyo. They're usually quite mild, but they come, they come from like Philippines, and then each one has a different path, but like 30 or 40 every year. And wow. I mean, they are pretty ferocious, but fortunately, well, Tokyo is everything which can fall down has already fallen down. Right, okay. Because there are so many typhoons. And but in the west of Japan, it's tougher because it's like the west of Japan is like 1,000 kilometers or 1,000 miles away. So wow. They're much like in Kyushu, they're much tougher. If you like, I can't get, I sent, there's John Williams, the filmmaker. Maybe I don't have his phone number, so I couldn't, I just tried it via Apple phone. and I sent him an email, but he isn't there here now. So if you like, we can start, if you like. And maybe John Williams comes in between. I'll quickly introduce him. There are just two more people to introduce. One here is Tony Banten, who is running Trinity in Paris. So he's in Scotland, he told me, but but the reason I know Tony is because he's running Trinity in Paris. And then we have Davide Otenga here also, who is Italian, but he works for a German glass company or optical precision company. He's Davide. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, hello. Hi, pleased to meet you.
Hi, Michael. I'm also looking at a different PC, so I didn't turn on my video, but I might if I ask questions later or to greet. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So if you like, Michael, we can start. You asked me to share. I've set up the sharing. So if you want to share anything, video or slides, or you're very welcome to share. For formality, I also want to ask you again, I'm recording this to all of you, and I always publish it on YouTube. So I just want to confirm with you again, if that's okay.
Fine with me, yeah.
That's great, because that way people can watch, and the college sometimes links it into the newsletters and onto the site, and quite a few people watch the recordings, those who miss it and others. So that's great. So if you like to start, great.
Great. Well, firstly, thank you. I know I've said a little hello to all of you individually so far, but it's great to be here. Thank you for having me, and very nice to meet you all. I was sort of invited to give a little talk about my background and how obviously my time at Trinity, and a little bit about what I'm doing now and life as a conductor, really. So I don't want to bore you all by giving you my life story, but it is relevant to some of my upbringing as to how I've ended up doing what I'm doing now. So I want to give you a little bit of a background as to how I ended up being a musician, full stop. So just sort of going back to the year dot, in a way, I was born into a family that are based in South Manchester area, so sort of around Altrincham. It's about half an hour, 45 minutes south of Manchester. I'm born into a very non-musical family. My parents had sort of loosely learned the piano when they were children, but nothing more than that. And the reason I was first introduced to music was that my granny, who lived only about a 10-minute walk away, lived next door to a retired piano teacher. Now, I was about 3 or 4 at the time, and my sister, who's a couple of years older than me, were introduced to this lady who, for me at that time, she seemed as though she was about 170 years old. She was probably only about 60 or 70 and had recently retired as a piano teacher. And she said to my granny, who was her next door neighbor, "Why don't Helen and Michael come and have some piano lessons?" And so my parents said, "Sure, why not?" And so just as I was starting school, so sort of as a 4-year-old, I was very, very young. We used to sort of walk round the block, round the corner, and go and have a piano lesson. And really, the rest is history from that point. I don't remember much about that at all, but my parents always say to me that I just was obsessed with it from day one. And I used to play the piano all the time. I'd go and have my lessons, and then as soon as I'd come back home, I'd carry on playing, and I just loved it from day one. And I just played and played and played every day for years and years and years, and absolutely loved it. And I was reflecting when I was putting my thoughts together for today that one of the amazing things, and one of the things that I really benefited from and enjoyed doing up to the age of about 12 or 15 or so, was all these regional music festivals and competitions that they had. I don't think it was exclusive to the northwest of England, but even in that small enclave of sort of Cheshire, South Manchester, there were small little music festivals and competitions happening in all these tiny little towns most weeks or months of the year. And so my poor long-suffering parents just sort of ferried me around from music competition to music competition every week, because I was desperate to be doing them. And I worked through all the associated board grades 1 to 8, as everybody does, but at the same time loving performing, doing these music competitions. And so we had a sort of good 10 years of doing that. And I progressed from my piano teacher that was the friend of my granny's to one of the piano teachers at Chetham's School of Music. So obviously a sort of much more distinguished sort of level of education by that point. And around the time I was leaving prep school, going to secondary school, 11, 12, 13, my piano teacher then said, why don't you come to Chetham's and have your secondary education there and really sort of pursue playing the piano very, very, very seriously. And I didn't. I remember thinking about that, and I remember thinking that it didn't feel 100% like what I wanted to do. And I think within a year or two, I was beginning to realize that if I was to pursue a career as a concert pianist, I really needed to be practicing 6, 8, 10 hours a day. And as much as I loved the piano, it wasn't the lifestyle that suited me as a person. As much as I absolutely loved and love it as an instrument, it's a very solitary instrument, apart from occasionally perhaps doing some chamber music or a piano concerto where you're put together with an orchestra. The piano is fundamentally a solo instrument. And I think I knew and was realizing at that point that I didn't have the sort of solitary discipline to be on my own for huge swathes of all day, every day. Around the time I realized that, I carried on with the sort of secondary school that was linked to the prep school that I was at, which was a Catholic school. I come from quite a Catholic background on both my mother and father's side. And I'd sung as a little boy at the prep school, but it wasn't quite the same as the Anglican cathedral tradition. I was technically a chorister, in inverted commas, at my prep school, but it was more of a sort of concert choir, and we occasionally did vespers and sort of liturgical services, but it was definitely not the sort of Anglican cathedral tradition of services 7 days a week. And I mention that because that's relevant to what happened then when I came to apply to Trinity. But I decided not to go down the sort of specialist music school route. I carried on with my Catholic education, but playing the piano very seriously alongside. Once my voice had broken, and my voice broke fairly late, I was about 13, my choir director at school said, why don't you think about playing the organ now that you're not singing anymore and you're sort of keen on your keyboard skills? Why don't you think about playing the organ? So I did, and actually really took to that and enjoyed playing the organ very, very much. And so for 3, 4 years, 5 years, however long it was, certainly no more than that, I continued my piano and my organ playing alongside doing my GCSEs, doing my what were then AS levels, which I gather now no longer exist, but the year between GCSEs and A levels. And then crunch time came, and it was thinking about what to do leaving school. And I did really know at that point that I didn't want to pursue being a concert pianist. And so I thought, that's probably it then in terms of a career in music. I'll go and study for a degree and do a job and keep my music going on a sort of very keen amateur basis alongside whatever my professional career might be. I'd done work experience with barristers and was beginning to really think that the law was the route that I wanted to go down. I genuinely enjoyed that as well. I still often say if the music thing hadn't worked out, I think I'd be quite happy in a wig and a gown, just putting on a show of a different variety. So I was thinking by GCSE sixth form time, it's probably university degree with a view to possibly a career in the law after that. Now, it was my organ teacher who said, well, sure, if you want to go and read a degree at university, great. What about doing an organ scholarship somewhere? And I must say, it wasn't really anything I knew. It wasn't something I knew much about at all at that point, but I'd done pretty well in my GCSEs and I was predicted to do pretty well in my A-levels. So Oxbridge became an option from school. And so I went on open days. I did one of the Oundle prospective organ scholar courses, which I just think are absolutely amazing. And particularly for somebody like me who really wasn't from, as I said, that cathedral Anglican background, it just opened up this whole world to me. And so having done that summer school weeks course, I thought, right, yeah, absolutely, Oxbridge it is. Organ scholarship I'd love to try for, but still to read law or something else at that point. My school, which didn't have a particularly great music department, but that didn't impact me too much because, as I mentioned before, I was getting all the music I wanted from outside of school and lessons in my own time outside of school. They were very, very encouraging, and they just said, look, this is something we don't know very much about, but if your organ teacher can help you with the organ scholarship side of things, we as a school will help you with the academic side of things. But the school said, if you're even remotely unsure as to what you want to do beyond university, beyond degree, don't go and read law unless you're 100% certain that you want a career in the law when you leave. And one of the best bits of advice I've ever had was they said, particularly with somewhere like Oxbridge, go and read a subject that you are interested in, because they'll see straight through it at interview. If you're claiming that you want to be the world's next top high court judge, but actually you're not 100% sure you do, they'll see straight through it. And it was one of the best bits of advice I ever got. And so I just thought, well, do you know what? I quite like music. I'll apply to read music. And then if I am very keen on the law beyond that or anything else, a good degree from a good university is always going to be helpful. I can always do a law conversion course, whatever. So I applied to read music and I submitted my application to Trinity, read music with an organ scholarship. At that point, Richard Marlowe was still the director of music. This would have been 2004, and I applied for 2005 entry. And I went and I played to Richard. I did my organ trials, all went sort of well. But Richard turned around to me and said, I'm concerned that you don't have enough experience in the Anglican tradition, playing psalms, all the repertoire that goes with evensong, where they're doing 4 services a week. And I think he was absolutely right. And at the time, I think I was beginning to realize that actually, as competent as I was playing the organ, and as much as I enjoyed accompanying and working with choirs, I just didn't have a huge amount of experience of the Anglican tradition. So he said to me, as is the case actually with lots of organ scholars who go to the bigger colleges, or where there's sort of more commitment, King's, John's, Trinity, maybe Clare, Keys, and so on, it is quite common for an organ scholar to take a gap year before going up and just having a sort of year completely immersed in the tradition, getting as much experience as possible. So he said, yes, we'd love to give you a place, but a deferred entry for 2006. So obviously I was a bit thinking, what do I do? But Richard was very helpful, and he emailed through to me and my school a list of the cathedrals that did gap year organ scholarships and said, apply for one of these and go and do one of these before coming up. So sure enough, I applied to several cathedrals and did a little sort of grand tour of UK cathedrals applying for these roles, and I ended up at Worcester and had the most fantastic year there. Obviously, Worcester being one of the 3 choirs festivals, there was not only one of the 3 choirs cathedrals, it was not only Anglican services back to back 7 days a week, but it was also the work for the 3 choirs festival when that comes round each summer at one of the 3 different cathedrals. That was absolutely fantastic, and that was the first bit of conducting experience I got during that time. The then director of music was a chap called Adrian Lucas, who'd been at Worcester for about 6 or 7 years, I think. And he very quickly said from day one, right, you've got to play the organ, you've got to accompany this, you've got to take the boys' rehearsals, and you're going to conduct evensong once a fortnight, at least ideally once a week. And so, I sort of had no idea what to do. He just sort of pushed me in front and said, move your arms, 3, 4, go. And it was a real baptism of fire. I remember being absolutely terrified, but he was great because he just sort of pushed me and said, go and do this. You've got to learn how to do it. And he mentored me through my time there, and taught me some of the actual just physical, technical elements of conducting, just, you know, basic 101 stuff. And that was really, really great. And I remember not particularly loving it, but kind of, it was fine. It was part of the job at the start, but gradually beginning to enjoy it more and more. During that year, Richard had announced his retirement from Trinity, and Stephen was appointed as his replacement. And I do remember feeling a bit strange about that, just simply because when I'd applied to Trinity, Richard was the boss and Richard had appointed me. And so I assumed Richard would be there when I was there. So I remember feeling a bit strange about it, but immediately all Adrian Lucas and my other colleagues at the cathedral said, hang on, this guy is amazing. Look at what he's done, buy his records. You know, you're going to have a great time working for this guy when you get there. So year finished at Worcester and went up to Trinity, and it wasn't exactly the 1st of September, but for ease of dates, 1st of September 2006, there was a new organ scholar, me, new director of music, Stephen Layton, new dean of chapel, Michael Banner, and a new chaplain of the 2 chaplains. So it really was complete, almost sort of starting from scratch again in 2006. And it was, I mean, I know a lot of stuff was said and speculated at that time as to the handover and everything. And it was a peculiar, and I mean peculiar in the sort of purest sense of the word, time, in that it wasn't just the direction of music changing, it was the fact that all these other very critical members of chapel life also changed. And I think it was just in this slight limbo for a lot of the first term where everybody was finding their feet. You know, Stephen was starting with a new choir, or rather a choir that was new to him, but the choir itself, 2/3 roughly, had all been Richard's appointments and sung with Richard for a couple of years at least. So they were sort of one choir. There was my year intake, which was, you know, roughly 1/3. We were coming to it completely new. There was then the dynamic of the choir with its new boss in a chapel with a new dean who had a vision for the chapel, the sort of culture and style, for want of a better word, of the chapel itself, and a new chaplain. So I remember feeling it was a slightly strange time, that first term, while everybody was just sort of slightly finding their feet with how everything went. But you know, by the time Trinity, we'd done our big Advent service at the end of that's Michaelmas term, isn't it? Yeah. Everything felt very sort of solid, and by Lent term and onwards then into my subsequent years, everything settled down to feeling very sort of strong and very productive, and a very positive environment to be in. And I will talk a bit more about Stephen later on, but I remember reflecting with him. I saw him just a few weeks ago, in fact, over the summer, and I have often said to him that the choir is just absolutely fantastic. He is absolutely fantastic, but I am so grateful looking back that I was there with him at that point, because he created this amazing Rolls Royce of a choir within that first year of being there, and that was my first year, 2006 to 2007, and has since, which is arguably as difficult, maintained that standard ever since. But I love the fact that I had the opportunity to be there and see him go in at sort of ground zero with a hodgepodge of former choral scholars from a different director and a different style of choir completely, with a small intake of new people, and he molded it absolutely and completely into his image very, very quickly. And he's not had to do that since, because he's been in the job ever since. But I always look back and think that that was a very valuable experience for me, to see him work with a completely raw product, coming as a complete outsider through all of that. And that was a very, very formative year, I think, for me, as everybody's first year is at university. But I definitely look back on that first year and think that that had quite a profound impact on me. So I was reading music at this point. thinking increasingly that I was rather enjoying reading music and not reading law, and that was probably the right decision. Stephen was a very hands-on director of music in the best possible way. So he would schedule, as well as doing all the services and rehearsals that were part of the choir's calendar, he would schedule at least once a week, if not twice a week, conducting lessons, working through accompaniments with me, just working through talking about the music. It was so amazing to actually sit down and say, you know, we're going to do this in this piece. And the reason is because I think it's that. What do you think about that bit? And what, you know, how would you handle that corner of the music? It was collaborative. It was equal. It was diplomatic. It was all these things. It wasn't just a case of, right, it's 5 o'clock. We've got an hour until the service starts. Let's just rehearse it, get it right. And then you can all clear off and go back to writing essays. He was very collaborative and a great mentor from the get-go. I had a junior organ scholar by my second year, and he, for various reasons, decided that by the end of his first year and certainly into his second year, that it wasn't something he was particularly happy doing, and that he might give up the organ scholarship post a year early, so i.e. not be organ scholar in his third year. At this point, Stephen had already appointed my junior's successor, so to become junior, to start in 2009, which is when I would have finished my 3 years and left. Now, I mean, it was unfortunate that for my junior that he didn't really sort of take to it and didn't enjoy it massively. But Stephen said to me in my third year pretty early on, look, it looks like your junior isn't going to want to stay. I'd love for you to stay for a fourth year and do more of the same. Would you be up for it? And of course I leapt at the chance. So I did my 3 years undergrad, and I did a 4-year, what was called the BMus, I think, which very sadly doesn't exist anymore, but it was half dissertation, half recital, and a lot of time to practice and play the organ and conduct and everything for the rest of the year. So it suited me down to the ground, and I absolutely threw myself into Trinity choir and life and in the college in my 4th year. And so I had an organ scholar who then had arrived in his first year, and he was really hungry to learn and go straight in at a higher level as possible. So I got on extremely well with him. He is a very fine musician. And so the 4th year was in a way the icing on the cake, because it was an extra year for me to stay, totally submerge myself in learning with Stephen, all the amazing experiences that Trinity Choir had, and it was absolutely marvelous. So I did eventually have to leave at the end of my 4th year, and at this point I had decided that the law probably wasn't the thing for me, and Stephen had said to me quite strongly through my 3rd and then definitely in my 4th year, look, you should definitely give this a go as a career. Think about being a musician, and you can try all these different, you just go to London, he said, by whatever means, he said, get yourself somewhere to live and just get on the sort of circuit of being an organist and a freelancer and all these sorts of things. And so I thought, fine, okay, let's go and do it. I'll do it for a couple of years, see if anything happens. If it does, great, we'll see to what extent things look like there's a future. And if it doesn't, then, you know, I'll still go and retrain as a lawyer. So I moved to London at the end of 2010, having graduated in the summer, and basically did what so many people have done that were in my position. The first thing I did was get on the circuit of the enormous number of London churches that do Sunday services, weddings, funerals, baptisms, special services, livery things, you name it. And fortunately, as an organist and with my background of having been at Trinity, it got me straight on that circuit. It got me straight on that circuit when I moved to London. And so I was doing lots of church playing, which gave me bread and butter money, paid the rent, paid the bills. And it meant that around the edges, I could then start to explore other things. Now, I'd been doing lots of conducting, obviously with Trinity and under Stephen when I was at college, but I'd also set up my own group then, and I was doing concerts of my own during term time whilst a student. So I was very keen to try and keep the ball rolling with that. obviously as an organ scholar, I moved to London and was doing lots of playing and lots of conducting, but lots of my choral scholar friends from the years above and below were also moving to London, some were going to conservatoire to study opera and do sort of very ambitious vocal things. Other people were going and starting careers in office jobs, but were still extremely highly qualified choral singers and were happy to do lots of singing around the edges. So for several years, just sort of mucked along a little bit, putting on gigs, small projects that were very sort of hand to mouth in local churches and self-promoting them, but keeping the conducting going and keeping the sort of group that I'd founded loosely at Trinity going and giving it a bit of momentum. There is a big network of churches in London, as I've said, all of which have organists. All of them need a deputy or somebody to cover from them. So there were WhatsApp and text groups with 40, 50 organists in. I need somebody to play for this. I need somebody to play for that. And then what sat nicely alongside the London churches was actually the huge number of amateur choirs in London, choral societies, chamber choirs, semi-professional choirs, full-blown professional choirs of all shapes and sizes that need and continue to need accompanists for rehearsals and people to rep and repetiteur for things. And it's amazing. And I always think it's just a wonderful thing about the musical life of this country. And I'm talking specifically about London in this instance, but how it's all done through this quite informal network. And, you know, oh, is anybody free to play for, you know, a Monteverdi choir rehearsal tomorrow? Is anybody free to play for London Symphony Orchestra chorus rehearsal tomorrow? And people just say, yeah, I'll do that, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so fairly early on, I ended up covering for a few rehearsals with 3 quite big amateur choirs, choral societies, one being Islington Choral Society, one being Epworth Choir, which is just outside London in Woking, and one being the University of West London Chamber Choir. And it was as simple as I got a message saying, could you dep and play for these rehearsals? I did, and I started to become the regular dep whenever they needed somebody. Their regular accompanist stepped down or moved on to the next thing or whatever. They offered me the job and then did that for a couple of years. And then eventually the director of music left, retired, moved on or whatever. And I got offered the directing job. And that happened with all 3 of those choirs. And, you know, you could just say it's slightly sort of dead man's shoes that I was just there at the right place and hung around long enough until the next person left and I moved up. But it's not, you know, my situation and my experience of that is not unique. And I know it's happened to loads and loads of people. Obviously, I wanted at this point very much to be pursuing the conducting side of things. A lot of people who've come from the organ scholar route want to stick to playing, be it piano or organ or whatever. But I wanted to pursue the conducting route increasingly at this point. So as these jobs became available, there was quite a sort of organic opportunity, shall we say, to sort of apply for them or be offered them. So within, let's say, 4 or 5 years of leaving university and being freelance, I found that I'd suddenly ended up with a few pretty good regular gigs on my plate that were sort of occupying me for rehearsals throughout the year with regular concerts. And again, it wasn't just that it helped paying the bills and the rent, but also with a lot of these choral societies, and I single out Islington Choral Society particularly, that I still direct now. They're 140, 150 strong. They're extremely good. And this is an amazing demographic that there are people who sing in Islington that are 20 years old, and some of them are 80 years old, and you have every possible age in between. We've got high court judges, we've got surgeons, we've got journalists, we've got creative media types, but they all turn up on a Tuesday evening really hungry to work hard for a couple of hours. Lots of them have also been choral scholars in their time. And as I mentioned with lots of my contemporaries when we first left, we're really keen to keep it going. The choir is well funded. And so we do 3-4 concerts a year with good professional orchestras. We engage good soloists, and we work to a surprisingly high standard for what on paper just looks like a large amateur choir. So there are groups like that I keep working with that I really enjoy just on the simplest level, but where it's a great opportunity to trial makes it sound like I'm just using them as a guinea pig, but certainly get through and learn and perform big bits of repertoire that I either wouldn't have the opportunity to perform otherwise, or it gives the chance to learn these pieces and perform them before then doing them again. And as you know, Susie on this call will know, and lots of people will say in whatever form of life, you know, everything's a little bit easier when you come to perform it or deliver it or give your speech the second time. So these choirs are amazing at giving everybody the opportunity involved to sort of do these performances, learn this music, get the repertoire under your belt, and then everything's so much easier the second, third, fourth, 24th time that you've done it. So I've kept those and continue to keep those bigger choral societies going, which I genuinely really enjoy doing. Around the year or two just prior to COVID, it probably wasn't 2 years, it was probably more like a year or 18 months, I was beginning to realize or feel that having been a freelancer, you say yes to everything. I arrived in 2010, hungry for work, hungry to try and make this work as a career. And I'd said yes to everything. And by 2017 or 2018, I was just absolutely mad, working 7 days a week from first thing in the morning to last thing at night, and loving it, don't get me wrong, but realizing two things. Firstly, I was completely exhausted all the time and didn't have much of a personal life around the edges. But also that as the premium work, or the work that I really wanted to be focusing on, there was more of it, and it was arguably becoming a bit more high profile and high pressure. I had no time to prepare for anything, and I was feeling that I was just rushing at the 11th hour into every next concert. And I was suddenly, you know, looking at the watch and thinking, oh my goodness, right, I've got a rehearsal tonight and then a concert in 2 days' time, and I haven't really looked or prepared the music as much as I would like. So it's difficult, and I've got friends who've started businesses well outside of music and the creative arts. I've got a friend who started a law firm and all different types of what look like very stable careers. And everybody I've spoken to says the same thing, which when you're freelance, you never lose that fear of where the next bit of work comes from. And, you know, you could be sailing this great wave of loads and loads of work, but, you know, what happens if it all just dries up the next month? And I don't think perhaps one ever loses that as a freelancer, and you still have bills to pay and all those sorts of things. But it had got to the point where I realized that I think I was just doing too much. So a year or so prior to COVID, I decided that I wasn't really doing much organ playing anymore. So I was going to hang up my organ shoes and stop doing that. So in giving up my Sunday morning commitments as an organist, I suddenly had my Sunday free. And even that one day in the week made a massive difference to my own sort of psyche and just feeling like I had a break in the week. There were a couple of other groups that I was working with fairly regularly through the week and through the year, and I felt like I'd done 5-6 years with some of them and had the most amazing time, but probably exhausted what I could in terms of learning and benefiting from that experience. And likewise, they'd probably had enough of me by that point as well. So it felt like a natural point at which to just draw a line under one or two things in order to then be able to give more energy and focus to the things that I saw as career progressing. So that was a year or two before COVID. And then obviously COVID gave me a lot of free time, much against my will, when that arrived in March 2020. And it was a bit of as it was for lots of people, this is by no means, you know, a sob story for me, but March 2020, there were 2 days where the phone rang and rang and rang, and just everything was cancelled. And, you know, I don't need to dwell on that when we all know what happened. But it made me realize how precarious the industry is. And lots of people said, you know, this is going to be the death of so much of the arts. Classical music won't be able to bounce back from this, and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, fast forwarding to roughly where we are now, I've been amazed and so heartened by how much it really has bounced back, far more than even I'd wondered. And I was pretty optimistic all the way through. But the resilience of it, not just the performers, not just the audiences, but just the general spirit of people wanting to get out and, have nice things in life and create beautiful things that isn't just all about whether the economy's succeeding or not, as important as all that is. So it's been amazingly resilient, and I feel very much like things have come back, and from my perspective and a career perspective, better and stronger than ever. So I know one of the things that you mentioned to me to discuss was where my career is now and what my ambitions may be beyond that. So I've touched a little bit on what I see as the sort of term time things and my term time work engagements. And it's been so funny, actually, Monday this week, how much it just feels like back to school this week. I mean, it's a long time since I was at school, but it's funny, you sort of hit the 1st of September and it feels like you're back to school. And so much of the classical music season runs September through to June, July time, and follows those term times with breaks at Christmas and Easter. So I have 2 or 3 regular choirs that follow those term time patterns with 8, 9, 10 rehearsals and then a big concert, 3 or 4 throughout the year. That is then supplemented by groups that I work with, some not so many amateur in this instance, but sort of semi-professional. There are choirs like the Whole Singers and the City of London Choir that rehearse project by project. And I'm just about to start a Whole Singers project, and they'll do 6 weeks of rehearsals and then a concert, and that will be it. And I might work with them 3 or 4 times during the year in a much more sort of concentrated manner. And although this project I'm just about to start with them, as I've said, is 6 or 7 weeks of rehearsals, I then generally do a concert with them at Christmas, which is only a couple of weeks of rehearsals and then 1 concert. So that's the sort of middle ground of projects that I do that make this patchwork. And then at the sort of other end of the spectrum are the one-off gigs with the sort of fully professional groups. So I get invited to guest conduct with certain orchestras and certain choirs. And that sometimes may just be a day or 2 of rehearsals and 1 concert, or in some instances, it can be a week of rehearsals and then say 5 or 6 performance concerts of the same piece, but 5 or 6 performances. So it's there are those 3 swim lanes, as I sort of like to think about it, in terms of where my work is now. They are all jobs and roles and commitments that I am engaged to do. So they'll email me and they'll say, right, this is the repertoire, these are the dates, this is the fee, here's your contract. But alongside this, and I'm keen to touch on it as it is my baby and the thing I love, the group I founded when I was at Trinity, London Choral Sinfonia, and then sort of kept ticking over when I moved to London for the first year or 2, then took a big inflection point around 2015, 2016. And that was largely due to the fact that a family friend who works in business, but is a very keen amateur musician, said, look, what are you trying to do here? What's your USP? We don't need, why does London or why does the UK need another choir? What are you trying to do with yours? What's your sort of business model? What's your 5-year strategy? How's your finances looking? How's this, that, and the other? And so obviously I just stared completely blankly and nodded and had no idea what the answer to any of those questions was. But he said, right, we're going to sit down. I can help you from a business perspective. I can help you get a board of trustees. I'll help you get charitable status. I'll help you think about these. He had other friends in the music industry, and he said, have a chat with them and see what they think. And so that was a real inflection point, the sort of 2015, 2016 point where I was forced to sit down and actually think, it's all great having these ideas to do this lovely piece of music, or I've always wanted to perform this bit of Bach or this bit of Vaughan Williams, but actually somebody in the background saying, well, hang on a minute, does this make sense from a business or a marketing perspective? So that was great. And actually, it's probably one of the things that I think there not enough emphasis or not enough education is given to people when they're learning to be musicians. And I think I don't include Cambridge in this because people are there studying for degrees, but doing music very seriously alongside. But a whole dozens and dozens of friends I know who went through music college as singers or organists or pianists or whatever come out and they haven't been taught anything about how to do an Excel spreadsheet, how to manage your social media. The fact that if, as somebody told me very early on as an off-the-cuff comment, if somebody emails you, just reply, even if you don't know the answer, or even if you need to say, hang on, I'll get back to you with that answer as soon as I know. Little things like that. And the music industry, I think, is increasingly seeing how it needs to be commercial and it needs to be viable. And all these things like marketing strategies, 5-year plans, business models, Excel spreadsheets are absolutely critical to all of that. And I think from what I've seen and talking to contemporaries who've been through conservatoire and a lot of musical training, not enough emphasis is put on that. I was very fortunate that this person fell into my life who said, look, I'll help you with this and I wouldn't mind a hobby alongside the day job, kind of thing, and helped me get that off the ground. And so London Choral Sinfonia sort of took an inflection at that point, and we got a recording contract. And I increasingly, if I could talk for another hour about the recording industry, which I won't do now, but as archaic and as old-fashioned as 60, 70-minute albums are, the fact is that against all the odds, 20 years ago, I remember people saying to me, albums won't exist. It's all going to be Spotify, Apple Music, just individual tracks here and there. And okay, the Spotify and Apple Music and the streaming services has happened, sure, but people still devour, and the industry still recognizes and puts emphasis on an album, which just happens to be this slightly arbitrary length of 60 to 70 minutes. But concerts also are very important, I think, and with a group where we're trying to, you know, build and maintain sponsors and funding and all these things, it's critical to engage your sponsors and keep that community side of things going. But the best concert in the world is pretty much old news the next morning. And, you know, if you've got a good review and a newspaper for it, fantastic, but it's pretty much gone the next day. But a record and an album and something you can find on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you take your music these days is sort of like a business card. Nobody makes any money from them really anymore, and they cost a lot to produce. But I personally still set great store by them and think that they're going to be around for quite a while yet, even if we adjust slightly with the duration of said album or said product. I think they're an important thing, and I set great store by them and have a 2 or 3 year recording strategy and plan in place for what we'll be doing in between all of those concerts. So LCS is my baby and something that I love, and it keeps me awake far too many times at night wondering about what to do next. But again, in the patchwork of the career and all my other stuff, which is the sort of 6 days a week, 6.5 days a week, let's say, of brain power and attention, I love having something that is mine and that I'm, you know, sort of in control of, for want of a less maniacal description, and have some control over the future and thoughts and plans, so on. So I hope very much that my career will sort of continue in the same, looking fairly similar, which is the LCS as a sort of personal backbone to it that will continue to grow and grow, and the patchwork of freelance projects around the edges with some groups that I work with regularly, and the one-off guest conducting appearances here and there in between, the profile of which I hope continues to grow. And, you know, if the Berlin Phil come knocking one day, I will absolutely say yes. But to keep continuing to grow all of these things. It's an amazing job to do. I found myself reminding myself, as our outgoing Prime Minister said the other day, it's the best job in the world. I mean, I would say that being conductor is the best job in the world. I know, Gerhard, we talked about sort of in some of the, if we open up to a discussion in a moment about talking about what's involved with conducting, but I'm just going to preface this a little bit by saying that, you know, that as with any job, there is a degree of technicality that's required and skill, and you've got to be able to conduct 4 beats in a bar or 3 beats in a bar or 9 beats in a bar. You've got to know what's going on in the music, and if there's a big, you know, something's about to happen or the violas haven't played for 170 bars, you probably need to cue the violas just to make sure they haven't lost count. There are technical things like that that you need to be on top of and need to be prepared and physically able to demonstrate and show and be clear. But beyond that, it's so much psychology. I think, in fact, it's sort of, I think it's 90% psychology. I really do. You're getting your musicians, be they instrumentalists or singers, basically to do what you want, which is a sort of fairly brutal but pretty accurate way of describing it. And with at one end of the spectrum, I think if you're dealing with amateur or semi-professional singers, there's much more of a sort of a bit more of a human side required, where I think you need to coax a little bit more of the human spirit into it and encourage a bit more. And I think critically with singers, unlike instrumentalists, where if you shouted and screamed at a violinist, they'd still be able to move their bow back and forth and play pretty well. I really believe that this, with the psychology of singers, particularly non-full professional singers, that if you create an atmosphere or you create tension or it becomes combative, for a singer, their body is their instrument. And if there's any whiff of tension, I think you're just going to make them perform less well. You know, whatever the science or psychology is behind that, I've witnessed it from playing the piano or repetitoring for rehearsals, where some great conductors are just tyrants in rehearsal, and you can just see the whole room, even with full professional singers, just getting a little bit tense. And I just look at that and I think, well, it says two things. Firstly, your singers aren't relaxed, and so you're only going to be getting, you know, 95% out of them as you would like. But also, if you're getting angry with them, it's possibly because they're not doing what you want of them. And if you're a full-blown top flight conductor and you're with the best choral singers in the world, then the problem is probably that the conductor isn't being clear or isn't ably communicating what he or she wants from those singers, and the frustration is leading to the tension. And anyway, I've sort of I digress slightly with that, but I do want to slightly labor the point that I think with singing particularly, psychology is such a critical part of it. And I think my advice to younger conductors would always be, you know, orchestras, choirs, amateur, professional, go in, be prepared as heck for anything. You know your scores inside out, back to front. Don't leave anything to chance. And if there's something where you think, okay, I'm going to have to work a little bit hard on that to get what I want, because perhaps it's not what most people might expect from a first playthrough or a first read through, know exactly how you want to get it. Have 2 or 3 different approaches. If the first approach doesn't work, try a different one. Try them twice, sure. But if they haven't worked beyond that point, then it's leave it and then self-reflect and think, why has that not worked? Do I need a 3rd or 4th strategy to get there? Or is the strategy right, but the technical tools weren't there to make it clear to those people? So I think psychology is such an enormous part of it. My final sort of point to this really is that for somebody in my position, I'm anxious with the records that I make and the concerts that I do, that I am saying something about what I want London Choral Sinfonia to be, what I want Islington Choral Society to be, what I want people to think Michael Waldron as a conductor is about. And it does require some careful thought about repertoire, because if I just programmed Bach and Handel for every single concert I do, people would say, okay, he's a Baroque person, he loves his Baroque music, and you suddenly find that that's how people view you. Whereas if you at the other end of the extreme, if you just do crazy plinky plonky modern music all the time, you get known for doing that. By the same token, if you're doing Handel one day and then Stockhausen the next day and Mozart the next and this, that, and the other, that's not very clear in some ways. And you think, well, hang on, okay, is he doing all Bach with this group and they're a specialist Baroque choir and that's a specialist contemporary choir? I'm slightly, perhaps I overthink it, but I do think it's important to think about this? What is the message of the group you're working with and the music you're performing and recording? What does it say about you as the conductor? What does it say about the soloists that you're wanting to engage? And I find that I am forever thinking about striking the balance between performing and recording music that's extremely well known. You know, performing the Messiah by Handel, you've got to have something to say about it, really, but you don't want to be gimmicky and just spray on all this sort of fakery or doing things to be different just for the sake of it. But I loop back to my point about knowing your music inside out, because I think if I sat down with the Messiah score for, you know, I know that piece inside out, but I bet if I sat down and looked at my score for the whole of the rest of today, I'd probably find some new stuff in it. I certainly would find some new stuff in it. And I'd probably be led to thinking, well, how, you know, here's an interesting bit that I've never seen before. What could I do there when I next perform it? So the core repertoire and the well-known repertoire and the well-known composers, I think it is important with a saturated recording market, with concert performances of Messiah probably every day of the week up and down the land, to have something to say about it and to be thoughtful of it. And alongside that, discovering new music. I love new music. I love commissioning things. I love discovering works by well-known or lesser well-known composers that have just never been performed before, sometimes for good reason, sometimes they've just been overlooked for all sorts of mundane reasons. So in other words, I like the whole spectrum of new music to old music and discovering new things, as well as trying to sort of champion very, very well-known bits of music. So that's all a psychology game as well. You know, what message are you giving to your audiences about what you are as a musician, and what your group is, and the message for your sort of career beyond all of that. So yeah, it's a fascinating world. It is the best job in the world. And my very final point before I sort of finish off is that I was very fortunate. Unfortunately, it was under slightly sad circumstances that Stephen Layton was unwell at the start of this year. He's absolutely fine now, but he ended up having Lent term off. I had to step away from Trinity for Lent term, and he asked me to take up his job for Lent term at very short notice. And it was absolutely mad and bonkers commuting to Cambridge 3 or 4 days a week, as well as trying to do all my other stuff in London and juggle everything. But it was the most wonderful experience going back, having had the distance of 10 years or so since I was there. The students were obviously a bit younger, quite a bit younger than me now, but just seeing their enthusiasm for it. And it reminded me that what we had during our time there was just this limitless enthusiasm, everybody's eyes wide open. There was never a sort of dull, jaded day. People just went in to rehearsals, even for a really mundane midweek evensong, and loved it. And I loved going back and again seeing the psychology of a very different environment, where you're working with the same group for 3 or 4 months, probably not 3 or 4, 2 or 3 months, 4 or 5 times a week. None of the work I do now is that intense with the same group of people. And so that required a slightly different psychology, because, you know, some days the music was very, very difficult, and people, you could tell, had a long day of lectures and essay writing, and they needed a different sort of coaxing psychologically that wasn't just about conducting that piece in a certain way. Other days you'd go in, Sunday evensong, everybody a bit more relaxed, big music, everybody knew it really well. And then you had the psychology of almost like sort of dogs on the end of their leads, wanting to be let off and go absolutely wild for a big Sunday evensong. And that required a slightly different approach psychologically, whilst also being the guy or the girl who's consistent out front. You don't want somebody who's up and down, different every day of the week. So that was, I close with that little anecdote about how lovely it was to go full circle and be back at Trinity and work with the choir for the term, but also realizing how much of what I learn and what I feel now about doing my job in London and abroad in a professional sense relates totally to working with them. Anyway, I hope that was of some interest, just giving a little bit of background to how I've come to music and still not gone into the law. I have pretty much ruled that out now. So I'm sticking with music now. And yeah, it is absolutely wonderful. It's the best job. It presents lots of difficulties in all sorts of unique ways, but I wouldn't change it for anything.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much you really brought the passion over to us. I have maybe 2 questions or 3 questions, which I've indicated to you in the email. And after that, I'd like to ask Susie if she's willing to have some discussion with you, which will be professional. I mean, I'm a total, I was a third in mathematics in my country where I come from, Austria, but music, I failed in any test I took, so so I was good not to focus on music. Maybe it was good for you not to go to law, but I'm sure you'd be a great lawyer as well now. The 2 question is,
Gerhard, sorry,
yes?
just to say that I have to leave.
Why don't you ask your questions now then, and I do my
for a
stuff
doctor's
after.
appointment. I'm so sorry, I have to peel off.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead, Susie. I didn't know that. Please go ahead.
Sorry about that.
No.
Just to say, Michael, it's extraordinary. You were so articulate in outlining this profession, and also what shines through and what I think about a great deal is how the collegiate organ choral scholarship scene spawns the greatest richness in our country. And this is really off the back of centuries of unbroken tradition that is unique in the world, and how fortunate we are in the UK to have this, and also that how resilient it is, and how it's one of the great, in a difficult world, how it's been one of the most consistently great and growing in quality traditions, success stories in the world. I hope I don't sound too over proud in saying that, but I think that this is a real jewel in our crown, and it's at its apex, and that apex is growing. I mean, the quality of choral scholars and organ scholars is just enhanced year on year. There's no sign. I mean, we have alarm signals from time to time, but there's no sign of that being degraded in any way. And I think to have people like you come into this profession with these extraordinary, peerless skills is, something that we really must treasure and appreciate deeply. Couple of things that you touched on, which I think, I'm constantly asked to mentor, give advice, etc. I think there are 3 things. One is that you touched on is leadership, and how our profession really does can teach a lot about leadership in so many ways. The second is the interface, which I think, again, young people coming into this profession don't appreciate, or the distinction between orchestral conducting, choral conducting, the different disciplines this requires, because every choral conductor is going to have to face an orchestra at some stage. And then eventually, where a lot of us are taken, not me, I have no interest in this, but it's a natural trajectory, is towards opera. And we learn our craft, and particularly someone like you, being an organ scholar at one of the Oxford or Cambridge or other university colleges, which affords these extraordinarily rare and brilliant opportunities to develop one's craft. You are actually thrown into the deep end, aren't you? But increasingly, I think it's incumbent on us to understand the technical and musical challenges of being an orchestral conductor alongside being a good choral practitioner. So the third thing is our recording world. The great dilemma we face. I quite agree with you. Working towards an album is so critical, a 60-minute album. Very few people buy CDs. It's a big problem. Everybody accesses us through Spotify and Apple. But you craft a program, a 60-minute program. All the awards, all the reviews come through album releases. And so we have to raise eye-watering amounts of money to record up to the required standard, a 1-hour album, but we can never recoup that money. The record labels are struggling. They can give small advances, but we have to find the money to put down a really good album. And then people access it through the singles. So we're in this kind of very difficult time as musicians to, we're stuck in a technological point in history, an audience requirement point in history, where recordings are very, very difficult. It's a very difficult forum to negotiate. So it would be really good to sort of open up those areas a little bit before I scoot on.
We're going straight to your final point about recordings. I totally agree, and with there's something I think will change over the coming years. But just going back to the simple number of this 60 minutes, it is so bizarre because in concerts, you don't do 60 minutes straight through, but yet, as you say, we spend hours crafting these beautiful programs for these albums that flow and where the composers are linked and where it has a narrative journey. But it's not even like that program and those sets of pieces would ever be heard exactly like that, uninterrupted for 60 minutes anyway, or it would be very unusual for it, because generally concerts are what, 40 minutes with an interval, two lots of 40 minutes with an interval in the middle. It is strange, and I wonder, I would like to see the time limits changed as far as albums and releases go. Now, I know that there's increasing numbers of what's called an EP release, where you can just release one track or a couple of tracks, and it could be basically any length, but they don't get picked up, reviewed, acknowledged at all, compared to albums that are 60+ minutes long, which is strange. So from a personal perspective, I'd like to see the situation change, whereby the magazines, the websites, the reviewers, the critics, everybody involved with acknowledging recorded music is prepared to give a bit more weight to standalone releases of single tracks. Or if you want to just release a Beethoven piano concerto that's 30 minutes, just release that piece and don't worry about making up another 30 minutes just so you've got a complete album. I would like to see that come over the coming years, because, as you say, the market logistics of it are insane. The costs involved with putting these albums together are gigantic. There's little or no money from the record labels, and then you're basically giving it away as soon as it goes on Spotify or Apple Music anyway. So as the performers, we are forced down this route of creating this product with this considerable expense. And there doesn't seem much shift from the other end, those receiving these recordings from a professional perspective and critical and perspective, that there doesn't seem much shifting up their end. Maybe that will come, and eventually maybe the finances of this will just be the ultimate dictator, and people will say, do you know what? We just haven't got 60 grand to make that next album, but we've got 20 grand and we're going to do 20 minutes of music instead. And that's going to be it. And it's going to force the hand of the record labels and the reviewers and all the publications that register these recordings to give them the acknowledgement that they deserve. Just because they're not 60 minutes doesn't mean they don't deserve attention. But going back to your first point, I wholeheartely, I couldn't agree more about the choral tradition and music making just being the jewel in the crown of this country culturally. And it's it's disappointing how a lot of people just don't realize quite how astonishingly precious that is. And it reminded me of, again, just doing the job, if you like, at Trinity back in Lent's term, that
this is
that's all right. Bye, Susie.
Away, I'm afraid.
Don't worry. Was that I had to be involved with the choral trials to some extent, and as far as I'm aware, I understand that sort of 30, 40 years ago, if King's or John's or maybe Trinity had a pretty astonishing singer or organ scholar present themselves, there would be a little bit of leeway. So instead of needing, let's say, 4 A's, they might be happy with 2 A's and a B or something, because they saw that there was somebody who was such an astonishing musician that they would get through the degree fine, but they would add so sufficiently to the life of the choir and the chapel and the college more widely that a little bit of leniency could be given. Now, whatever you think about that and how that used to be, that is absolutely not the case now. And I saw this firsthand, that the admissions tutors at all the colleges, and certainly from my experience at Trinity, it is resolutely that person needs straight A's or straight A stars even now. I think you can guess it's A level. And there is just no, there's no leeway. Even if they're the best soprano or the best organist in the world, they need to get their absolute best possible grades to go and read whatever subject they're going to do. But the reason I say this is that it doesn't, as Susie rightly said, it doesn't seem to be diminishing the overall standard and the journey that these people go through. And you know, up until only a couple of decades ago, it was boy choristers only becoming the tenors and basses at these college choirs. But my generation, so there was a choral scholar, soprano choral scholar at my time at Trinity, who was the first girl chorister when Winchester Cathedral started the girl choristers. And of course, now most of the cathedrals have a girls' choir. So the sopranos and the altos are coming through with this amazing cathedral tradition. And you know, I've kept my ear to the ground at Trinity through Stephen, and it's been amazing. The choral scholars that I got to know through my time there, loads of them, top of Tripos for this, top of the year for that, as well as being choral scholars on top of everything else. There was no leniency allowed for their admissions grades, but not only have they got their places and they've got a place at the choir, which is making music at the highest level, they're getting the best degrees in the college and the university. It's pretty amazing, and it's something to really be treasured and cherished, I think.
You know, concerning the depth of musical tradition in England, and of course also in Trinity, you know, I took my first degree in physics in Bochum in Germany, and then I came for a PhD to Trinity. Yeah? And one of the many things I was completely amazed by moving from Bochum, Germany to Cambridge, England, was that, you know, Bochum has about 50, university has like 50,000 students. Yeah, Cambridge has like 10,000 students. And Bochum University has one single university choir, one single university orchestra, nothing else.
Right.
Yeah?
Really?
Whereas
Yeah.
Cambridge, I didn't count, you know, but there must be 100 or more, you know. It's just, you know, so, it's like day and night, you know, no comparison whatsoever. No? And in Germany, I think, I don't know what I'm not a historian of music in that sense, so I have no idea how that developed over time. Yeah, but I'm pretty sure in Germany that Hitler time, you know, was a complete breakdown of civilization, essentially. Right. That this destroyed so much. You know, I don't know how much more there was before, but that still has impact today. You know, whereas England, I mean, never had this kind of break. You know, England has continuous development of all these traditions, including musical tradition. Huh? Not
You're
only,
right.
but...
It is that unbroken tradition, and of course, you know, the Reformation was a significant event and a substantial one musically. I mean, and then particularly the yo-yoing back and forth with the Restoration and the sort of 50, 100 years or so. But the amazing thing is, and I'm sure lots of you have heard about how Elizabeth I, you know, she turned a blind eye to William Byrd and the amazing music he was writing as an acknowledged Catholic, really, because she knew that, you know, creatively, aesthetically, it was just absolute, almost sheer perfection, really. So even despite the sort of religious turmoil and then the complete black and white change, really, with Anglicanism. As you say, the visual and the oral and the aesthetic side of things has maintained, and trends have come and gone. Music was very pared back at various points in favor of clarity of text and legibility of text and all of these things. And then there were periods of great florid writing, and it changed all through that. But as you say, fundamentally, it was and is unbroken. And I think that's why with these institutions, and I think the institutions feeding the education are as big a part of this. It's not just the people writing the music. You need, it's the people there who are learning it from such a young age, studying it and going on with it. And then, you know, you look, even some of the biggest opera singers in the world have been Oxbridge choral scholars at some point. It's pretty astonishing, really.
Handel came to England, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And lots of Mozart came to England. You know,
I didn't know that. Oh, really?
Yeah, Mozart did. Mendelssohn. You know, lots and lots of composers, great composers throughout history, have been through the UK. And we had. I think also because of the monarchy as well. For up until relatively recently, the monarchy is such a wealthy institution, patronized a lot of the arts. It commissioned composers. Queen Victoria was very friendly with Mendelssohn, and I don't know actually whether Victoria ever commissioned anything from Mendelssohn. I don't know that, but as a wealthy institution, the royal family in this country could support the arts. And, you know, in Handel's time, it was, you know, largely lots of it was paid for by the crown. These theatres were underwritten by the crown, and the performers were. And nowadays, I suppose that our monarchy isn't engaged in the arts in quite the same way. And the collapse of our sort of aristocratic system means that hasn't continued in quite the same way. But our new aristocracy, I suppose, are the bankers and the lawyers and the people successful in business in this country. And thankfully, it seems like a lot of them are willing and wanting to continue to support the arts, but it needs supporting, and it always has done. And you know, you look at the numbers, as Susie and I touched on earlier with the recordings, just how expensive they are, and you don't get the money back. And I would argue that's no reason not to do something just because it doesn't make sense on paper financially, but it needs people who do have some surplus resources and want to support the arts to give money. And you see the US, how well they do that. You know, their universities with these multi-billion dollar foundations, and all these people pledging colossal amounts of money. And that has only really, I think, just started to happen in this country in the last 10 or 20 years. And I think it's growing, and it will continue to grow because people see the necessity of doing it in this country. But it's how the wheels are oiled, really, in this industry. It's very important.
You mentioned composers and writing music. So one thing I was thinking to ask you is, have you composed at all, or how does that? How do you see that as a music director and conductor? What's the interaction with composers, and do you compose, or how do you work with composers?
The short answer is no, I don't compose. I had, as part of my tripod in first year, we all had to compose a short song cycle. Absolutely everybody reading music had to do it. I reasonably enjoyed it, but I found it a very tortuous process. And once I'd done that and submitted that, I thought, never again. I'll leave other people. I'll perform it. I'll leave other people to write the music for me instead. So no, composing isn't something I do. But
is that so different? It needs completely different.
Yeah, it really is. And
passion, different passion, or.
Yeah, I think it is a different passion. You do find that there are some composer conductors and some people who you often find that composers latterly start to conduct their own music.
Okay.
And I mean, a good modern example is the choral conductor Eric Whitaker. He was a composer by training and had enormous success writing music, and then latterly started conducting his own music and has become a bit of a conductor in his own right. And historically, the same things happened. Vaughan Williams, for example, started conducting his own music, and lots of great composers have done that over the years. But despite me having said I don't write any music myself, I do love new music, and Susie and I both reference their commissioning new music. And I have an album coming out with London Choral Sinfonia at the end of November, and we are recording a cycle of albums. This will be the third installation of music by a contemporary composer called Richard Panchev, and we commissioned him for this third album to write an organ concerto, because, you know, as a former organist myself, I know that there's not much in the canon of organ concertos, and what there is are mostly gigantic. If you think of things like the Saint-Saëns organ concerto, they're absolutely enormous. They require colossal orchestras, and again, logistically, practically, financially, they're out of reach of a lot of groups and performers. Now, yes, there are smaller chamber organ concertos, but it's not an area of the repertoire that's inundated with options. So I said to Richard, he's an organist as well as being very experienced writing for orchestras and choirs. And I said, look, why don't you write a chamber organ concerto that is not outrageously difficult, that's, you know, still challenging, but that, you know, a reasonably good amateur orchestra could pick up and learn and perform, and that a very competent organist could learn. And we try and contribute something back into the canon of repertoire for the future. So I never said to Richard, right, I want a C major chord there and a G major chord there. But I did sit down with him and say, look, let's think of the logistics here. String orchestra with a couple of trumpets. So it's not huge and therefore not expensive. Let's think of it in terms of practical levels. Let's not make it outrageously difficult, so that, as I mentioned, an amateur orchestra might be able to pick it up and do a reasonably good job of it. And also let's think about the length of it, because practically speaking, most concerts are 40 minutes with an interval and then another 40 minutes. Now, there's no point writing an organ concerto that's an hour long, because it will probably never be performed. There's no point writing an organ concerto that's 10 or 15 minutes long, because by the time you've paid a soloist to learn it and come and perform it, 15 minutes is not even one half of a program. So I said to Richard, write something, let's say, that's about half an hour, 35 minutes, that can be most of one half of a program, perhaps with a little short overture before it, whatever. But we came to that, and I feel, I quite enjoyed having a little bit of input, just on a sense of, you know, what would be nice to commission, what would be useful, what would highlight the skills and resources of London Choral Sinfonia well, and what would also result in a piece that might be performed more widely beyond this recording. So yes, composing, actually writing the notes is not for me, but I do like, with the commissioning process and the new music process, seeing what's there and perhaps having some involvement, and also with new music that's never been performed before, if it's by a living composer, 9 times out of 10, they're really desperate to have their pieces performed and composed. Composers will come to rehearsals, they'll come to recording sessions, and I love that collaboration. And I'll say, well, what did you mean here? Is that really the tempo mark you meant there? What about doing this here? And the composer will say, oh, that's a great idea, or no, that's a terrible idea. But you have some dialogue, and you have some collaboration with the new music and with the composer on bringing these pieces to life.
Maybe last question is, you've mentioned that a bit when you talked about the psychology, that the psychology is so important to lead as a conductor. Is, you know, as a non-musical person, I've been many times to concerts, of course, and opera, and you see the director with the back to you in the audience, and you see he's clearly guiding the orchestra with movements of his body, but this is an outside amateur view. Nah? So you said psychology, but, you know, what is the essence of how you lead the orchestra. You know, what is it to be like when you watch a violinist, or you know, I studied piano, so you know that's more easy to understand intellectually what it is actually what they are doing. Do you know what I mean?
I totally know what you mean, and it's a very good question, and one that people do ask. I would say it's when you're working at a reasonably high level with an orchestra or a choir, you don't need to keep time. You don't need to go 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, with experienced musicians, and certainly with professional musicians, they will be able to do all of that. So basically, the job at that point as a conductor is to start the piece. You know, you're there, you're firing the starting gun to get the piece started. But from then on, you could leave a great orchestra to play a Beethoven symphony, and they could do it without a conductor. You know, I'm not disparaging my own job or my colleagues by saying so, that if you got a good group of musicians together and you start them off on a piece that's pretty well known, they get from start to finish, and it would probably sound jolly good, and it would be fine. But at those sorts of levels, and the situations you're describing, the conductor is shaping the music as you go in the journey. And if you think about something,
when you say shaping in the journey, you mean at this concert, one specific concert, you mean, or you mean all through the life of including the rehearsals before and selecting the people and maybe changing some artists?
It would be a bit of both. The rehearsals, generally speaking, you would be finessing the technical and at the most fundamental level, the speeds, the ensemble, you know, are the flutes exactly in time with the violins at that point, which they need to be. The rehearsal process is really consolidating the absolute technical side of things, whilst also getting your musicians and performers comfortable with what to expect from you, the conductor, as the person to take them on their musical journey, whether it's a 3-minute piece or a 30-minute piece. So the rehearsal period, I would say, broadly speaking, is about the finessing the technical side of things, introducing your musicians to your roadmap, your geography of the performance and the direction, so they know the speeds you want to take, the dramatic moments, what are they? But when it comes to the performance, you can really use that opportunity to hopefully be comfortable and safe in the knowledge that all the technical aspects of the performance are completely safe, but then using the fizz and the magic of a live performance to be spontaneous and shape things. And if you take a huge piece, I don't take a Mahler symphony or a Bruckner symphony, that is a huge journey to go on, and you need somebody. You could start the Berlin Philharmonic off on Mahler 5 and they play it brilliantly, but to get it really brilliant, you have somebody, the conductor at the front, to take the orchestra and the audience on their journey with it. And in the performance, it might be that certain, let's just say there are certain swells and moments that build. One conductor may want those initial earlier swells and builds to be quite big, because they may say, right, this is the first moment of the journey where I feel that the lid is coming off the box and this is happening. Another conductor may come along and think, do you know what, these earlier swells and these moments need to be smaller because there's a longer journey to go on and we don't want to peak too soon. And all those moments are demonstrated by the use of the body. Basically, it's not beating those 4 beats in that bar, but it's shaping those 4 beats in that bars with gestures of all different shapes and sizes. And when you think that you've got 2 hands, 2 arms that aren't beholden to beating your 4 beats in the bar, the possibilities for expression and being demonstrative and conveying your message and what you want from the story are endless. There are limitless combinations of this hand doing that, this hand doing that, to show just infinite numbers of of expressions and gestures. And also, don't forget, there is your face as well. And that is a big part of it, that your musicians, good musicians, will be watching the conductor. They're not going to be head buried in the score, looking at their music and nothing else. It's totally collaborative. So you want your singers and your instrumentalists to be watching you. And the face is a very open, expressive tool, arguably as expressive, if not more so, than your hands and your arms. And you know, I've performed for other conductors where I've seen this used very, very powerfully, even just from, you know, the closing. What if something's very quiet and hushed and there's a pause? The closing of the eyes is incredibly powerful, and that's just one very small device. Likewise, we've all seen conductors, you know, massive gestures. They can convey great power, but sometimes the smallest gestures in the world can be equally powerful. If something's very quiet and very intense, just the tiniest movement can say a huge amount about the music at that point, and about what you want as the conductor from your musicians. So that's what happens in the performance, really, that again, the psychology really takes over, that the adrenaline is pumping for everybody. You're delivering your live finished product. The energy is in the room. You're no longer in the rehearsal period for hours and hours doing the same bit again. That's when you shape the journey. That's when you find these moments. That's where you pull all the tools out of the bag, physically, visually, psychologically, and you get your musicians and your performers to go on the journey you want, which hopefully to your audience behind you becomes a coherent, interesting, exciting journey through the piece of music, whether it's very, very short or a great big symphony.
Wonderful. I've never talked in this way with a conductor, so it's wonderful to hear this. It really expands my understanding. Alan, who has a question, and then I think we need to stop because everybody has to go on for the next thing.
Sure, yeah.
Alan has a question for...
I came in slightly before, after 10 minutes of your talk. I wonder if you could help me. For 15 years, I ran a choir in China, and we put on a regular annual Messiah, and we introduced Bach masses to China. Literally, we put on the first ever performance of Bach masses in China. Oh. But since the Olympics, religious music is banned in public in China. Right. My question to you is, what is serious choral music that is not religious?
There are you asking specifics or just generally about?
No, what specifically. What is the non-religious?
Well, I mean, my first, the name I've just mentioned actually is a very good example, Eric Whitaker, who has taken a lot of very good, you know, some of it very old poetry, and not just English poet or English language poetry, but has taken texts from other languages as well and set them to really fantastic music. There are, you know, great composers who aren't just living composers. I mean, Vaughan Williams, Holst. I was working on a project recently.
Yes, we've been through that repertoire. We're running out of.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, living composers in a way, I think are probably your greatest, possibly untapped resource if you've been through some of the sort of bigger names. But go on Boosey and Hawkes' website, Oxford University Press website, and look at they'll have very clear sections with contemporary choral composers. And I do that myself, looking for new music and new ideas. And I think because of the fact that, you know, lots of concert choirs exist now that aren't necessarily linked to religious institutions, and you know, the simple fact that not as many people are going to church these days, composers need to be marketable. So they need to be writing music that's not sacred or that's not liturgical in some ways. So I'd have a look on the Boosey and Hawkes website, Oxford University Press website, and there are a lot of really fantastic contemporary choral composers out there that are writing a lot of secular and non-sacred music. Eric Whitaker and Morten Lauridsen, both
manageable.
Yeah, very manageable. Lauridsen particularly writes very well for choirs. Those two, Whitaker and Lauridsen, are both American, but there are myriad other American and UK composers writing very, very good non-religious choral music.
Thank you very much indeed. Very helpful answer. I congratulate you on everything you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
hope they change the tax laws in the UK eventually so that donations will be deductible. Then you'll be away.
Yeah, we'll hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was John, maybe you're back now. Do you have maybe final question, John? John?
No, I don't actually. I switched off because I had to move around the house, but I was taking you with me. But I'd just like to say thank you very much, Michael. And I agree with you entirely about, especially about Skip Lauridsen. I mean, he is really, he's setting a lot of Neruda poetry, for example, these days, and is doing non-sacred pieces, and he, even though O Magnum Mysterium is still the top piece, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff out there by him and several others. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, there's the whole Californian scene, which Lauridsen really inspired from University of Southern California, is developed a real choral composing hub in Los Angeles, always helped by money from the movies, which helps keep things going. But thank you very much, Michael. I know Susie enjoyed it immensely, and so did I. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. I've really enjoyed sharing my thoughts. It's one of those, having started off by saying that the piano is quite a solitary existence, it is. Conducting is slightly less solitary, but it's very nice just to have an opportunity to communicate one's thoughts about what it's like as a career and as an experience. And yeah, as I say, it's the best job in the world, and I absolutely love it. So thank you for your time. It
is the last vestige of autocracy.
I think New York Times, I think, had a ranking of jobs, and they put the mathematician as #1.
Oh, did they? Okay.
Like woodcutter was like in the forest, like woodworker in the forest was like last.
I could imagine being outdoors in a forest all day. It's probably quite nice.
It's a job. I don't know why it was last. Okay, thank you so very much, Michael. And John, pleasure. Also, please give my thanks and all our thanks to Susie for her contributions. That was wonderful that she could join as well. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, yes, one last thing is, Michael, if you have any plans to come to Tokyo, please let me know.
I would be very happy to.
Then we can. It would be wonderful to have an in-person event with you here in Tokyo.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll do. Let's definitely keep in touch.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Michael and everyone.
Thank you.